Charges such as withholding classified or sensitive documents seem so small now compared to a charge like this of attempting to overturn a presidential election.
Former President Donald Trump now facing multiple charges from the January 6th riots at the Capitol. The indictment coming down late today for those 4 felony charges.
Christopher Salas is in Washington, D.C. with details.
Doug Shelley, prosecutors allege in the indictment that former President Donald Trump repeatedly lied in an attempt to remain in power and defraud the government he once led.
Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump.
Prosecutors allege former President Donald Trump conspired to defraud the United States, disenfranchise voters, and obstruct an official proceeding which led to the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. The 45-page indictment outlines 4 counts against the former president for his efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election results.
It was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election.
The indictment focuses on how Republican state officials, Justice Department officials, and the president's own campaign staff refuted his lies about the 2020 election. It also outlines an orchestrated plan by the former president and his co-conspirators to replace slates of electors in several key states to overturn the election results. President Trump responding on social media this evening, calling this election interference and the latest corrupt chapter for a, quote, weaponized Department of Justice. Prosecutors have asked a judge for an initial appearance date on this upcoming Thursday here in the courtroom behind me. In Washington, I'm Christopher Salas, KOAT, Action 7 News.
This is the former president's 3rd indictment in 4 months, and we have local reaction from New Mexico's Republican Party. Steve Pierce writing, this politically motivated indictment brought by another rogue prosecutor continues the weaponization of the Biden administration against their leading political opponent. While Martin Heinrich writing, with this indictment, President Trump's actions on and leading up to January 6th are now a matter for the courts, not Congress. Santa Fe Attorney John Eastman may be included in the indictment. CNN has identified Eastman as one of 6 unnamed co-conspirators. Eastman worked with former President Trump and is accused in court filings of promoting the idea the election was tainted by fraud. He also faces disbarment in California for professional misconduct. This is all part of an elaborate plan to keep Trump in the White House.
That includes a fraudulent elector conspiracy that prosecutors say would create a fake controversy at the certification proceeding. White House correspondent Kayla Norwood is in Washington for us with how that scheme would have played out.
False claims of election fraud and efforts to convince officials in 7 states to submit fraudulent slates of electors to Congress. Those are the charges at the focus of Tuesday's indictment by the Department of Justice's special counsel. So how would that have worked? Let's take a look at the role electors play in our election. Electors are appointed by state parties representing voters at the Electoral College and based on who won the popular vote. But in the weeks following the election, unofficial electors in 7 battleground states signed certificates falsely stating that Trump, not Democrat Joe Biden, won their states. That happened in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, New Mexico, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The indictment alleges as the Electoral College convened in December of 2020 to certify the results of the presidential election, Republicans who would have been Trump electors in those 7 states also met and submitted unofficial Electoral College certificates to the vice president and Congress, declaring Donald Trump the winner of their state, even though that wasn't the case. Prosecutors say he knowingly used false claims of election fraud to subvert the legitimate election results. The scheme failed on January 6 when Congress convened to certify the Electoral College results. The votes counted were the official slates of electors. In Washington, I'm Kayla Norwood.
Several of President Trump's Republican allies in the House and Senate tried to challenge several of the Electoral College votes. Those challenges failed. And former President Trump's indictment could play a role in the 2024 presidential election.
Action 7 News reporter Alyssa Munoz is here after speaking with our political expert about how this could impact New Mexico voters.
Well, Shelley and Doug, for years, New Mexico has been recognized as a blue state. Looking back at the 2020 election here next to me, you can see that although New Mexico stayed blue, there were some votes for Trump.
In a general election, news like this could hurt Donald Trump among those voters who are on the fence.
The charge against him for attempting to overturn the presidential election could affect how or if voters are willing to back him. But Sandroff does think this could affect his campaign treasury.
We've seen how his campaign treasury is being depleted by a lot of those campaign funds are going to pay for his legal defense in many of the other investigations and charges against him. So it could be a distraction to his campaign.
Those other investigations against Trump include documents probe, January 6th attack on the Capitol, and attempt to overturn Georgia results. Sandroff says states like Arizona could be impacted more by this charge because they're known as a purple state. But New Mexico has been trending blue in recent presidential races.
Typically, the Democrats been winning by double digits. So there again, in all likelihood, New Mexico will continue to be blue in the presidential election.
Sandroff also says Trump's poll numbers have increased since these charges. Reporting in studio, Alyssa Munoz, KOAT Action 7 News.
A New York Times Santa College national poll shows former President Trump remains far and away the leader for the Republican nomination. He is running even with President Biden in a 2024 rematch. That survey also shows both the president and Trump are viewed more negatively than positively by voters.
New financial disclosures released today show how much the former president is spending on legal battles. Campaign finance records show the former president is spending tens of millions of dollars on legal fees, including $25 million spent by a network of political action committees. Allies of the former president are launching a new legal defense fund to raise even more money.
If I weren't running, I would have nobody coming after me. Or if I was losing by a lot, I would have nobody coming after me.
Outside of fundraising for the former president, a super PAC supporting Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has raised the most money so far in the GOP field. To stay up to date with the Trump indictment, follow us on the KOAT app or at KOAT.com.